All right, let's speed run through managing wreck impacts. We've already talked about some of this stuff, so we can go pretty fast, I think. And this is all pretty straightforward stuff. So basically, in order to manage it, right, according to the sticker on Ruffner's door, office door, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So understanding what's going on, figuring out where am I on the impact percentage versus time graph, right? That all just comes down to fieldwork measurement. A bunch of GIS stuff, your favorite thing in the world, right? So at a qualitative level, you're trying to figure out what general kinds of vegetation do I have where people are actually going, right? So this requires a bit of, technical term is surveillance. You want to observe where people are going, and that can be from, these days, mass cell phone record aggregation, direct observation, closed caption TV, having field staff go out and unobtrusively follow people in plain clothes in well-trafficked public areas, so it's not like just them and just you. You're like, oh, I happen to see you guys again. Huh, stop following me. That would be for very busy areas. You want to know specifically where people are tending to go. So camera trapping is usually a more ethical and cost-effective way to get that done. And it can even be to the point of taking a little bit of like petroleum jelly and putting that on the lens of the camera trap in a big wide open area so you can see where a lot of people are with a bunch of successive photos or video. And blurring that lens just enough so that there's no way you could identify anybody personally. You're just looking for, oh, that's definitely a hunter orange blob on the landscape. That must be a person, right? I can see people are over on this hilltop, for example. Cost-effective way to do that. One note about blurring camera traps to protect people's PII, the personally identifiable information like biometrics, facial recognition, gait recognition, that's a thing, and so forth. If you use petroleum jelly to blur that lens instead of something like sandpaper on the glass or plastic lens, be aware that some species like bears, for example, have been shown to think that petroleum jelly tastes just fine, and they will try to eat your camera trap. Don't ask me how I know. Moving on. You want to know things like where people are going. Is that vegetation like the plantago, that basal rosette, the flat-laying species, or like grasswoods that can lay down and spring back up under use, or not? Is it more like the vaccinium, the shrubby species that people are crunching through and causing essentially the vegetative equivalent of human bone breakage as they're walking along? And overlaying where people are with where the patches of more sensitive, less resistant vegetation are is a pretty quick, low-hanging fruit GIS or even just field work observational exercise. So get out there, look at where people are going, look at where you have vulnerable vegetation species, and see where those intersect or overlap. And then start asking questions on why. Why are people motivated to go to this particular area? How can I satisfy that motivation somewhere else where the vegetation in this other place is much more able to resist or be resilient from those trampling pressures? One of the basic stats that we're going to do is we're going to do on-site, off-site comparison. So for every campsite that you find, you would measure what's the cover in a randomly located 1 square meter quadra. What percentage of the pixels inside that square frame are green versus brown or gray? Is one quick way to do that photometrically. And then we want to find a randomly selected spot that is not inside of a campsite nearby. So same ecosystem, same ecotype, same species composition and so forth, but minus the human trampling presence. So trampled campsite, totally untrammeled area nearby, within 100 meters in any direction, for example. We're going to tally up the on-site versus off-site cover, plug and chug it into this formula. We don't even do the math in the field. We just collect all this stuff, throw it into Excel on a cell phone or a data entry device like a iPad GPS or something, and set up this formula and this lets you know quantitatively it's only 50% cover loss in our campsites, but, well, offsite, that's only 50% cover anyway, so our campsites are doing just fine. They're just as not uncovered as the more natural areas in that space. So this gives us an objective comparison. There's no interpretation of this. We can just see what are people doing relative to what's already naturally out there in terms of trampling. Okay, so simple math, super easy. We're not going to get quizzed on this. Don't have to memorize it or anything. But this is the kind of stuff that gets us across the finish line and so forth. In terms of figuring out basically the same thing but for species composition instead of percent cover loss, we have this floristic dissimilarity index. I don't love the statistics of it. There's some mathematical artifacts with this approach that I'm not going to bore you with unless you want to get a PhD with me or something. And if you do, God have mercy on your soul. Anyway, but it was put together some decades ago by a giant in our field, a guy named Dave Cole, who was a recreation ecology researcher with the United States Forest Service at the Intermountain Research Station out west. Nice guy. What this does is it lets us know, again, objectively, how bad is my non-native invasive species problem. So you're looking for a site that is as natural as you can, right? Versus a site that you understand to be impacted potentially. And you see how much do the two lists of species agree with each other. So if your natural site that doesn't see any recreation impacts or use or pressure or seed transport or anything like that that we talked about earlier, if that's the same list of species as the campsite, then the floristic dissimilarity is going to be very low, and we can feel pretty good about that. If the floristic dissimilarity is very high, that is, maybe I have a lot of species at this site, the natural site, and a lot of species at my campsite, but they're not the same species, and I notice some non-native invasive species, in particular typically at the campsite, well then, that's a number that I need to pay attention to, and that gets inputted onto a map as a point value, and then we do this at all of the campsites, and we get a point value for each of those pixels on the raster grid of the map of our national park, and then we interpolate the floristic dissimilarity to fill in the gaps between those points. And that's a method called Kriging, spatial interpolation. And what that does is it lets us measure a bunch of campsites and a bunch of control sites and not have to measure the whole ass place. We can assume, probably reasonably enough, that places we haven't measured but that are between 2 points that we have are somewhere on a linear or curvilinear gradient that blends between the low dissimilarity value at one side and the high dissimilarity value at the other. We'll just assume that the point equally distant between them is equally distant between the high value and the low value as well. Okay? A little bit of GIS for you. Don't say I never did nothing for you. Moving on. We also want to, for any kind of new sites, or this is really an issue for trail relocation. A lot of trails in most of our national parks have already been built. A lot of them are over a century old. So the issue isn't finding new places to put in trails, it is absolutely figuring out problematic sections of trail that are leading to all sorts of downslope environmental impacts or injuries or search and rescue, and planning a relo, a close down of that problematic section of trail and a relocated section of trail that goes around the problem area. And so we want to select areas that go through grasses, as long as they're not like sensitive shore grasses, which is a huge reproductive environment for a lot of species. We generally want to prefer not going through heavy fields of forbs or mosses. Lichen, if it is crustose, good to go. Lichen that is crustose is like the gray patches, the splotches that grow right on the rock face. They're flat to the rock, and so forth. Foliose and fruticose lichen are the kinds of lichen that grow up and away from the rock, and they are extremely, extremely fragile. They will literally turn to dust if you touch them wrong. So in places where you have high lichen activity as a primary soil producer that is digesting rock and turning it into soil, it's very important to keep those lichen colonies intact. So you want to route trails away from fruticose and foliose lichen, and not really care one way or the other about crustose lichen, because you can walk all day on that stuff and not really hurting much. So yeah. So we're basically taking into account the growth form, right? So we want people around mature trees. We want people around grasses, sedges. We've even done some experiments of different grass species, using those to seed trails to try and keep the soil of the trail itself. So walking this little grassy path in the middle of a forest, turns out that's super resource intensive and works great, but is very expensive, and so forth. And this is very much on a meter by meter basis, right? So you guys know how heterogeneous a forest floor is, right? There might be a stump hollow, pit and mound kind of situation, and so like 3 meters to one side, and we avoid a bunch, like a patch of Christmas fern or something like that. Another 30 feet deviation on the relocation around that, and we avoid maybe a vernal pond or an ephemeral stream, something like that. So selecting ground cover is typically the second stage after the much more coarse, done from aerial imagery or digital elevation model resolution stuff of planning the gross location of the trail. And when you actually get the trail crew out there, the trail boss has to be empowered to make on-site 10 meters to the side of that or that of the original planned or mapped trail center line to avoid problem spots, to emphasize durable control zones like a boulder that's sticking up, right? We can run people over boulders all day long, no big deal, and so forth. Okay? So, for those of you who are interested in thinking about this kind of work career-wise, this is what one of the field surveys, this was the data collection form, and so today it will be a digital version of the same thing. This was a lichen impact study at C&O Canal National Historic Park on 80-foot cliffs overlooking the Potomac River. And the trails here were not hiking trails, they were vertical trails. We call them climbing pitches. We see the exact same kinds of impacts we do vertically as horizontally, just with the particular dynamics of climbers instead of hikers. Okay, so if this doesn't look too complex or horrible, this could be your job. And collecting data in a gridded format, and again, not doing any math in the field. This is at SIU. I feel so dirty for taking this video. I should have blurred the faces. Look away. Right? It's a convenience path. Now, this person's riding that bicycle across grass, graminoids, pretty resistant resource, and everybody else is on concrete, an extremely resistant surface, right? So when your human capacity and your infrastructure capacity get overloaded, look for nearby other more natural, softer surfaces to start taking the brunt of overflow impacts, right? This is not rocket surgery. This is nothing you guys haven't seen before, but this is how it actually looks at a national park as well. Same idea. Okay. When providing that concrete surface, like in front of Morris Library in that last video, here this is south rim of the Grand Canyon. When this isn't enough to keep, in particular, kids off of very, very arid soils, slow-growing, woody, non-herbaceous, high elevation. This is at around 7,000 feet elevation, so this is a tough growing environment. It's absolutely okay to fence people off, in a front country environment. Okay? Cool. So, to just kind of drive home the point, we'll finish on this, to illustrate how powerful people's just sort of mindless desire to look at a cell phone and walk is. Let's take a look at examples of desire paths from all over the world, right? How much time are you saving shortcutting this corner? If this is 1 meter and this is 1 meter, my math trigonometry brain says this is 1.2 meters. 0.2 meters, right? A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Pythagoras was a G, right? So these are everywhere. They're all over the world. There are so many desire paths, social trails, visitor-created trails, people's choice trails. There's a million names for them because they are everywhere in every culture. There's even a subreddit for these. Can you imagine how excited I was as a trail dork to find the Desire Path subreddit? I did this for you guys, for science, right? So academic quads are absolutely carved up, right? So in a national park context, we would consider almost all of these duplicative impacts because we have provided ways for people to get everywhere to all sides. It's just not the most direct way. And people ain't got time for that, I guess, right? So, desire path. Desire path. 2 desire paths. Yo, dog, I heard you like desire path, so we put a desire path in your desire path so you can walk a social trail while you walk a social trail. That's an Exhibit Pimp My Ride reference. It was so cool 15 years ago. Moving on. Right? There's a metric hecton of them. This one in particular, we'll pause for just a sec. Can you see, this is a relatively flat path, but can you see how this trail configuration with a sharp bend in it is very much like the corner of a switchback? All right, so shortcutting switchbacks is a particular and specific design issue when you are putting trails into a high slope environment. We were talking in the soil section of the class about how you want to put trails on high slope environments at the mid slope where the landform is steepest. To keep people off of the very steep areas, you have a flat trail going right through. But where you have to make that trail zigzag to go up or down the mountain slope, we very often see this. And so how do you prevent this? You use something called a control point. And a control point is something like a tree, but it's not a tree that's tiny and doesn't really cut off any of the other space. It's a massive boulder the size of a house, so that you have to go around the boulder and there's no easy way up the other side of the boulder to shortcut the switchback on the inside. So imagine a gigantic house size or enormous boulder or scree field here. It's a whole bunch of like sharp rocks pointing up and down. You don't want to walk across those, so you might break your ankle and so forth. So shortcutting a switchback and preventing that is absolutely a key function of why you always have the trail boss or the trail team leader when they're on site putting in, like actually cutting in the actual trail versus just blindly following what the GIS person thought the trail should probably be in the general neighborhood of, right? You're always ground truthing it to figure out how do I keep it off of sensitive species on or near grasses and graminoids that can handle it, and use control points or site ruination to make this area absolutely not wonderful to walk on. And in that way, we can protect it pretty well. Cool. And for my urban forestry homies, hazard tree removal is everywhere in national parks. These are heavily landscaped places, at least in the front country. So every tree that is around a visitor center, every tree that is anywhere near a campsite, every tree that is anywhere near humans, and where humans might be for more than a passing second on a trail, we have to pay a lot of attention to those trees because we are essentially certifying our fiduciary duty, our feasance, our ethical responsibility as professionals in this sphere, is to provide a safe place for folks. So to the extent that we have trees that are even slightly not great, if there's even a small chance that a tree could fall on, injure, kill one of your visitors, that tree is going to get some attention, and it might be of the extirpation kind. All right? Cool. Let's end class a couple minutes early. Got a couple more slides, but not worth starting up. We'll just put some stuff on as you're packing up. I'm around for questions if you have them. Let's do wildlife stuff on Wednesday and finish out our semester. Cool.
On my alternate field trip, I was trying so hard to get pictures of some of there are people who are making paths, cutting down this switchback in Giant City.